Hello.
Welcome back to the Space Gulag, otherwise known as PPSW, your favorite hangout place. Today we're back with another Star Wars story. Today we'll be taking a deep look into what would have happened had Anakin's fellow classmate Barris Offee fallen in love with him, with both Jedi being a part of the same class and only being separated by a 1-year age gap. How would their romance change the galaxy? Before we begin this video, let's smash that like button. I'm trying to shoot for 2,000 likes in the first 24 hours, and I release an untitled video. I have no idea what this video is going to be yet. This video is something you definitely won't want to miss when it comes out. We're also getting 15,000 subscribers, so join the Space Gulag. We will be part of our incredible journey here together. If you have ideas for videos, leave them down below. I read our comments, but I don't do crossovers. And one last thing, if you want to support the channel, check out the Patreon, Twitch, and community Discord. Special shout out to George Droid, Benjamin Wells, Gort, and Chancellor Lawrence Sanders for being grand tier supporters, and Jay Hoffman, Icy Raptor, and Warpigman 308 as massive tier supporters on our Patreon. Thank you all for supporting the channel. You guys are helping fund massive projects in the near future. And if you want to win a free sideshow collectible, watch to the end of the video and I will tell you how. Our story begins inside of the Jedi Temple. Anakin Skywalker is the newest face in the class of 20 students. Class sizes inside of the Jedi Temple were normally small. Anakin was unlike the other students. He was an outsider. There were several students in his class. All of them were around the same age. The youngest in his class was a girl by the name of Barris Offee. She was 8, while the rest of her class were either 8 or 9 years old. Anakin was 9, and this was the right age group for him to be a part of. While there were multiple classes of 7 through 9-year-olds throughout the Jedi Temple, this so happened to be the class that little Anakin was placed into. The culture shock of being inside of the Jedi Temple was immense for Anakin. Going from the dirty sands of Tatooine to the pristine halls of the Jedi Temple, Anakin felt so distant from everyone here. How could you blame him? He was from a desert world, living as a slave and friends with a group of kids who were relatively scummy and known to be vibrant criminals. The Jedi Temple didn't have that. Every child was well trained and they were ordained to a strict code that they needed to abide by. Anakin was the opposite. He had all the restrictions that being a slave came with. His morals were a bit out of whack, and so was he. There was a certain level of anxiety and sadness that trailed him. It wasn't common for a Jedi to possess such emotions. Many of the older were genuinely happy people. They didn't have much to worry or stress about, especially if their younglings were in the Order. The Knights and Masters, of course, had to deal with the struggles of the galaxy, and with the recent invasion of Naboo, the Order was heightened in their attentiveness towards the galaxy. For the time being, the Jedi knew that the Sith had returned, and while one of them was dead, there had to be another out in the galaxy. Anakin was now a youngling, and he had to begin his basic training. He would not be trained any differently than any other student. He may have been the chosen one, but he would be treated just like any other Jedi. Anakin had to learn about the Force and begin his understanding of the Jedi teachings. Being a Jedi was really quite simple. Follow the code, don't use the dark side, don't use your emotions. It was not that hard to be a Jedi if you hadn't spent your entire life being a slave. Anakin's introduction to training would begin quickly, and his ability to succeed in that training would be met with little resistance. Anakin was quick to catch on to the presence and the pleasantries of the Force, and he had no real issues with accepting the Force as it existed within his life. There was so much to unravel about this child, and as the hours moved to days and soon into weeks, it was apparent that Anakin Skywalker had an incredible affinity for the Force. He was very naturally gifted, and his ability to use and even the most basic lessons taught were outstanding. In his class, it was hard for some of his other classmates to achieve the little that Anakin did. He was much different in his regard to becoming a top of his class. There was so much raw talent within young Skywalker that the limit was endless on what he could achieve. Anakin's understanding of the basics would excel, but then they would stop. The ceiling for Anakin hadn't been reached, and it would be far until it was reached, but Anakin had to slow down to fit in with his class. Most of the class was up to par with him, but there were few who had their struggles. One of those students was the youngest in the class, Barris. Anakin, being the kind-hearted young man that he was, would reach out to help her by suggesting that he show her how to use the Force after class. Barris was a quiet youngling. Much like the rest of her class, she was a bit surprised by Anakin's outreach. It was uncommon for a student or a peer to reach out to one another, especially in the early stages of Jedi development. For Barris, she knew it was kind of embarrassing, and she felt kind of embarrassed by it, that she was being helped by someone else within her class. Anakin saw no reason for her to feel such over this and fret over this exchange because it was simply just elevating the class. Anakin had to slow down to wait for the others to catch up to him and the others, so this was also benefiting him, especially because Anakin was also used to being an assistant. He was used to helping people. The beginning of their studies with one another would start with stories from Anakin. He had so many more stories and so many more experiences, and all of them were so much more different than any Jedi in the temple that was his age. Even more so, let alone the Jedi that were older than him, who never faced the tantalizing task of being a slave. Anakin told stories to Barris about the Dust Bowl that was Tatooine. Their bond was established in this moment, where Anakin showed Barris that it was okay to ask for help, no matter how embarrassing it may feel. It's something Anakin could share, having difficulties in his life and feeling comfortable enough to express those feelings to his mother. Barris asked about what it was like to have a mother. The Jedi were all able to experience glimpses, nothing much more than that, of their families, and the lives that they left behind when they became Jedi. Inside of the temple, that was where their life began, but Barris was extremely curious as to what it meant to have a mother, or even a family. Anakin, being so young, only described it in the ways that he could, telling Barris it was like having wings of love surround you without ever wanting to let go, until you yourself were ready to fly. Barris didn't really understand. It wasn't her fault either. In a way, the Jedi did the same thing, but it wasn't as compassionate. Barris couldn't understand what Anakin was trying to tell her because it was all about emotions she was told to forget about. Anakin was just a boy. How could he even begin to explain the emotions of life? They were so complex it was hard enough for an adult to do it, let alone a 9-year-old boy who went through the culture shock of his life. The Jedi Temple was like living in black and white, and Anakin saw the full spectrum of colors. He could access things that no one else in the Order could. Barris had a lot to understand about what the Jedi couldn't reach, and what she had to work on letting go. Something Anakin wasn't ready to do was let go of those emotions. But there was also one issue. Barris was very intrigued by these emotions that Anakin was telling her about. Barris wanted to know about them and feel them. She was taught the code her entire life, but it wasn't entrenched in her back like it was everyone else. She was a bit of a wild one, and without a strict instructor forcing the code down her throat, she was living off of her own will and dedication. Now that there was an alternative to the code, she wanted a piece of it. She wanted to see the spectrum of colors that was the emotions that Anakin had. Anakin continued telling Barris stories of what it meant to have these emotions. The most that Anakin could do was tell stories and show her how he felt. Barris had a hard time understanding Anakin's emotions. She was so turned off by the emotions of her own, but as she spent time listening to the stories that Anakin told her, and the lessons that she was struggling with, she had no issue with reciprocating the force from Anakin, and him showing her the lessons that she struggled with. The time would slowly continue to progress, and it was ever so apparent to Anakin that he at the very least had a new friend within the Order. Barris, even though she wasn't struggling anymore, she still wanted to spend time with Anakin. He was a year older than her, and that was fascinating as it was, but even more than that, he had stories and experiences that she wanted a chance to know and learn about. While Anakin made Barris aware that slavery wasn't anything she wanted to experience, she expressed that she wanted to know of his love and the emotions that followed with it. Barris and Anakin became really tight-knit, but the time would come for her to show that she was loyal. Even though Anakin became acquainted with Barris, it didn't mean that he still wasn't an outsider. Most of the other younglings in the class saw him like a rival. When he first arrived, it was just whispers and weird looks, but as the months passed, it was more vocalized of a disliking towards Anakin. It was hurtful, and it was in his face. Bullies inside the class would try to put down Anakin, but there was always someone who had his back. Barris was the kindest girl in the class, and while she was a bit rambunctious from time to time, she understood the values of loyalty, something she learned from Anakin's stories of Tatooine. Anakin appreciated the companionship. Barris was extremely helpful to Anakin. If he didn't have her, then he would have felt lost. When Barris told her friend that she was trying to see through the colorless spectrum that she was taught, Anakin truly understood the influence that he had on her. He never realized that Barris picked up on everything that Anakin told her about his life. Anakin and Barris were really comfortable around each other, and Anakin didn't realize that Barris was helping him stay true to himself. Because Anakin was able to express his emotions openly, he had no issues with falling away from what made him so special. Though one day, during training, Barris would raise her voice from her normal quiet self. While she was a rambunctious student in nature, she was very quiet when it came to speaking aloud. Anakin was trying his hardest to do something and he got frustrated, to which a student called Anakin a slave to his emotions. Anakin turned around as waves of shock piled through his body. The word slave being referred to him made him extremely upset. He looked over at the boy as he thought of a rebuttal before the child was lifted off of his feet. Barris looked down at the boy, who said that he should be nicer to Anakin. Barris stood over the boy as Anakin ran over to pull her back away. Barris saw more than the black and white emotions that she now felt. She looked at Anakin like she had just opened her eyes to a greater sense of the world. She felt something beating inside of her chest, and she felt a glow from her cheeks as she looked at Anakin. Barris had a faint smile as she looked into Anakin's eyes. Anakin wrapped his arms around her as they hugged in front of the class. Anakin had to thank her for standing up for him, as the kids around didn't really know what to say. The teacher wasn't around either, and Anakin let go of Barris. She felt a whole new perception of life when she looked at Anakin. After the hug, she felt a feeling that she had never felt before. She looked around as she stepped away from Anakin and quieted herself back again. Anakin looked at the boy who called him a slave, and then back to the rest of his classmates. The students were quiet. They didn't say a word. The other student was most certainly in the wrong for saying what he said to Anakin, but the students didn't know what to say or think about the hug. Sometimes they happened, but they were extremely rare inside of the Order. As the younglings grew into their own and began more force training, and eventually lightsaber training, all of the students began to progress. Barris and Anakin's bond grew as the years began to pass. Anakin and Barris kept their secrets of emotionality hidden, and while they weren't exactly in love with one another, they were tight as anyone could be. They sparred with one another more often than not, and when they were in training, they were meditating in the Jedi Temple garden with one another. Anakin and Barris had each other's backs, and while there was something that terrified them, the selection to become a Jedi Padawan was around the corner. While they were excited to progress into the next level of Jedi training, they were afraid of being separated from one another. There was also a great fear for Barris. She was terrified of becoming a student to a Jedi Master named Luminara Unduli. There was a real reason to fear her too. Luminara would drive the emotion out of Barris. Over the previous few years, Barris and Anakin explored emotionality of themselves. While it wasn't a full-blown romantic infatuation for one another, it was a form of its own love. It didn't mean that they hadn't harbored feelings for one another. It was just at their age they weren't really sure about their own feelings towards one another. Sure about that love, if you will. Anakin over the years was able to thrive emotionally off of Barris, and Barris would do the same with him. Barris went from a colorless spectrum of emotions into a wide, fulfilled palette of colorful emotions. Barris loved to feel and express, and she emboldened her ability to do so with her emotions. She and Anakin became attached to one another. It was very uncommon for them to be seen away from each other, and while Anakin himself wasn't sure if he loved Barris like that, he did know one thing. He knew that he wasn't in love with Padme anymore. The idea of her was out of his mind. The day would come where these younglings would be selected to become Jedi Padawans. Anakin was already assigned the Jedi Knight, now Master Obi-Wan Kenobi. On the other hand, Barris would be selected by the older female from her own species, Luminara Unduli. Barris's worst nightmare as a teacher was selected to be her teacher, or Luminara selected her to be your student. Anakin felt terrible for Barris because he knew how much Barris would struggle with Luminara. Obi-Wan had no reputation, so Anakin assumed that Kenobi would be kind of like his own master. That would be the furthest from the truth. But once the separation of Barris and Anakin began, they would really understand the importance of their own bond with one another. Anakin and Barris had a way to get around the suffering of being separated from one another, and that was because they were apprentices now. Barris and Anakin decided that it would be best if they kept in close communications with their communication devices, because now that they were being separated, they needed to keep each other in their thoughts to make sure they handled being apprentices well. Obi-Wan and Anakin would immediately be sent off-world, and they would be separated from Barris and Luminara. This made Anakin and Barris distraught. They were upset to be apart from each other. Their bond was so reliant on being with one another, and their bond of having and sharing emotions was founded on being around each other in person. Anakin would soon learn that Master Kenobi was a bit like Luminara, but the only difference is that Obi-Wan wouldn't be nearly as strict. The problems for Barris would arise, though. She was enjoying having emotions just like Anakin. She didn't enjoy how strict and repulsive Luminara was. She would be forceful and downtrodden towards Barris, and she would make Barris feel bad for anything she did. Barris began to feel guilty for doing literally anything, and that included talking to Anakin. She was confused because she felt one way, and she was being pushed the other way, an emotion that Anakin was feeling as well. But Kenobi wasn't destroying him from the inside out. Obi-Wan was strict, but never, ever to the level that Luminara was. Obi-Wan and Anakin did butt heads, but for Anakin, because of his relationship with Barris, wouldn't feel the need to be arrogant around Obi-Wan. Having a friend be so close to him as a child made Anakin feel no need to be arrogant because he was so focused on uplifting her as they both progressed with one another. Anakin was incredibly talented. He was a force to be reckoned with. But Barris, she just wasn't the chosen one. The first couple of weeks would be rough once the separation began, but it would only get more and more difficult for the two Jedi. Eventually, the two would have the chance to meet up again, after months of being apart. Barris and Anakin would hug in the garden of the Jedi Temple. Their spirits felt bonded in complete unison after being separated for so long. The way it would be described by Barris would be the fact that she lost her vision. It was as if she felt like she couldn't breathe, nor could she see the colors and vibrance she could when she was with Anakin. Barris felt isolated when she was with Luminara. There were times when Luminara made Barris feel like she could turn her back on everything, on the Jedi, and leave it all behind for literally anything else. Anakin understood because there were so many times that he felt the same way when he was with Obi-Wan. Both students had masters that were extremely hard on them. These Jedi masters would put them through trial and tribulation. Even more with Barris, had a bit of a wardrobe change. While Barris wore looser fitting clothes when she was a youngling, now she was consistently wearing a robe with her hood up. Luminara enforced a strict uniform code on Barris that coincided with Luminara's values in the Order. Barris wished that she could be free of this suffering, and when Anakin and Barris met up again, after so many months, Barris felt hope in the Order once again. Barris and Anakin sat across from the tree in the garden as they leaned against each other, with their shoulders tightly pressed together. Their hands were hidden, but they were intertwined. Neither Barris or Anakin knew what would become of them, but they did know that this feeling right here is what they needed and what they wanted. After the trials of being apart, Barris and Anakin knew that they couldn't be separated, and even worse than that, they knew that they would be separated if they continued down this path. They needed to figure out what they needed to do. They were so focused on one another that they didn't realize that there was another Jedi looking at them from where they were. While it could be seen as an innocent friendship, Master Kenobi could tell that there was something else at work here. Something he remembered because of Anakin and Barris' interaction. Obi-Wan hadn't thought of it for so long, but he was reminded by his own youthful love. Whether or not it was romantic love or even a friendship of love, Obi-Wan knew that it reminded him of his extended mission on Mandalore. Because Obi-Wan was so new to being a Jedi Master, he didn't want to mess anything up. He wanted to make sure that he was able to teach Anakin the information that he needed. Obi-Wan wasn't sure if he could talk to Anakin about Satine, or if he could just leave it alone and let Anakin enjoy his privacy. The holding hands reminded Obi-Wan of the few times that Satine pulled him through the throne room, dancing with him on Mandalore when his master Qui-Gon wasn't around. Obi-Wan could see it in the physical movements. They were still very young, but it was not just their bond and their force, it was a bond in their actions. The gentility of leaning against one another and holding hands was the story of true friendship maturing into something maybe even more than friendship. Obi-Wan decided that he'd allow them some time and that he should reflect on the matter himself. As the ultimate trolling decision, Obi-Wan decided that he would meditate behind them, but without ever being made aware that he was there. He wanted to make sure that they would be able to turn around and see him, but see that he didn't really care that much. It would add a new level of trust between Anakin and Obi-Wan, but even more, a new level of security between Anakin, Barris, and Obi-Wan. Anakin and Barris would continue to sit there enjoying the moment and enjoying their time spent together, but Barris would turn her head as she gently laid it on Anakin's shoulders, and she looked over and saw Obi-Wan meditating. Barris nudged Anakin as he looked over and instinctively jumped back. But then he relaxed, knowing that Obi-Wan didn't mind seeing him around Barris in such an overly friendly way. Obi-Wan continued meditating while Barris and Anakin spent their time together, and then they moved back into the interior of the temple. Luminara would be kept out of the circle of information. Obi-Wan wanted to respect the privacy of his student and that of Barris as well. Maybe he was in the wrong, but he was trying to be the best he could be for his student. Anakin and Obi-Wan wouldn't bring up this topic when they saw each other next. When Anakin and Obi-Wan were out in the galaxy, doing missions with one another trying to bring peace to different sects in the galaxy, Anakin and Barris were focusing on being around each other. The two of them would continue to blossom beautifully with one another as they got older and older, though the difficulties would continue, mostly for Barris. Anakin wanted to support her because by the time he was 18, he knew that he loved her. He truly believed it and he could feel it, and Barris being 17 felt the same way for him, though their biggest issue was figuring out what to do with their feelings of infatuation. Luminara was a brute, and she was getting worse and worse. Her restrictions on Barris over the past few years were crushing of her morale. Anakin knew this, and it would break Barris if Luminara was continued to be allowed to do this to her. Barris, every time she returned to the Jedi Temple, would sob to Anakin, horror stories of being under Luminara's command. Barris expressed to Anakin that she didn't believe that she could continue to do this anymore. She was ready, and she wanted to leave the Order. After having dealt with all of Luminara, Barris knew that she couldn't deal with her anymore. She needed freedom. It could be said that she was so influenced by Anakin's emotionality that she refused to go to a way of life that didn't include having generalized emotions towards anything. Anakin and Barris talked while back inside of their favorite place inside of the Jedi Temple. Anakin and Barris had a lot to uncover, most of which was what they were going to do. Barris was skilled enough to become a knight. She knew a good range of force abilities, and she was well versed with a lightsaber. The Luminara was very obviously holding her back from becoming a knight. Luminara was very controlling over her apprentice, and while Kenobi was controlling, he wasn't controlling to the level that Luminara was to Barris. Anakin and Barris sat in Anakin's room on his bed, looking at one another. They wanted to know what they should do. Barris had her hands in Anakin's as they looked at one another. She suggested that they leave the Order. Anakin understood where she was coming from, but he pleaded that they stay. Barris told Anakin that it would be extremely difficult for her to become a knight otherwise if she wanted to stay. Luminara was hard on her, and it was very unlikely that she wouldn't try and hold Barris back from becoming a knight. Anakin thought momentarily as he rubbed her hands. He said that if there could be a way for the two of them to set up a situation for Barris to succeed in, even more so if they both succeeded, they might be able to both become knights, and then they would be free to do pretty much whatever they wanted to do. Barris's heart lightened up when Anakin mentioned the fact that there would be a way, or that there could be a way to do something about it, but they needed to find something that would catch the attention of the High Council. Barris figured it out, as she told Anakin that she had an idea for their promotion. Of course, it was a little bit of a selfish motivation, but the provocation to become knights would be through an act of emboldened to help others. Barris said she knew that Anakin would do this any day or any time, but it would require the two of them to sneak out and break some of the code to do it. Anakin leaned in as he listened, his heart was jittery with excitement. Barris said that they could free slaves in the Outer Rim. She knew it would be difficult, especially with the Hutts owning much of the territory out there, but she knew that if Anakin were to do this, it could bring closure to his heart and bring closure to hers as well. Of course, Barris would do this for Anakin, but it was a perfect excuse to possibly be barred from the Order to do it. Padawans were forbade from making deals with crime lords or even going out without their masters, and these two knew that. Barris then suggested that they didn't make an agreement, but they free them. They free the slaves, though the issue was that they would need to go undercover rather than just be Jedi. The Order couldn't be held responsible for such an act. Another issue was the fact that if the two were caught, they would have no assistance and possibly forced into slavery themselves. Anakin understood the risk and accepted it. He knew how important this was. As Barris leaped into Anakin's arms, thanking him for his compassion, he lost balance and they both fell back, laughing when they landed on the rest of Anakin's bed. They looked at each other and smiled. This was peace. They both knew that as long as they were together, as long as they had each other's backs, nothing bad could happen to them. They continued laying next to one another until they both accidentally nodded off into sleep. It was the middle of the night, so it was fine. It wasn't necessarily uncommon for Jedi to be in other Jedi's rooms. But sleeping in another Jedi's room was normally frowned upon. Anakin awoke to knocking on his bedroom door. Barris jumped up and down under the bed as Anakin told Obi-Wan that he could come in. Anakin groaned and looked at his master as he expressed that Obi-Wan should know that he wasn't a morning person. Obi-Wan smiled and rolled his eyes as he sat at the foot of Anakin's bed, looking over at his apprentice. Obi-Wan wanted to talk to Anakin, and figured he'd just get it out of the way so that it wouldn't be a big deal for either of them, and that they could just simply move on without worrying about it. Obi-Wan told Anakin that he was worried about him. Anakin's concern began to rise as to where this conversation was going to go. Obi-Wan began telling Anakin that it was by no doing of his own that he was concerned. Obi-Wan expressed that he was happy that Anakin and Barris got along so well, but Obi-Wan warned Anakin to be wary. Anakin didn't quite understand where he was going with this or why he needed to be wary. Obi-Wan said that Master Unduli was very strict, and if she had seen the two of them in the Jedi Temple garden at any point, she would have been very upset. Kenobi had seen Barris and Anakin in the garden several times, and he never personally saw issues with it, but he was worried for Anakin. Obi-Wan told his apprentice, telling Anakin that he always wanted him to be happy and never feel any need to fret about anything. Obi-Wan was truly happy that he had a good friend like Barris, and while the two of them were very close physically, it was okay, as long as it didn't go further than that emotionally. Anakin looked at Obi-Wan with skepticism, as Kenobi told Anakin that he just wanted to be sure that Anakin would stay safe. He understood that Anakin was likely to harbor feelings for people because of his upbringing, but he didn't want Anakin to suffer because of that. Anakin told his master that he appreciated the concern, but there was really nothing to worry about. Obi-Wan stood from the bed and smiled at Anakin and then left the room. Anakin toppled back over onto his bed, stretching out his arms as Barris pulled herself from under the bed. She told Anakin that he was truly lucky to have a teacher like Master Kenobi. Anakin smiled. He never really thought about it, but he did now. Obi-Wan was a wise master as Master Yoda and as powerful as Master Windu. It was just hard. They butted heads a lot early in Anakin's training. Barris got back on the bed and looked at Anakin as she said they should pick a time to go to the Outer Rim and begin their mission to free the slaves. Anakin nodded as he agreed that maybe they should do it in the later hours of the evening, because it was more likely that they would be able to get out of the temple without being approached by anybody. The two of them decided to meet back up in the later parts of the evening, back right here in Anakin's room. As the day continued and eventually turned to night, it was time for Barris and Anakin to leave the Jedi Temple. The two Jedi began walking through the hallways as they made their way towards the hangar bay of the Jedi Temple. They were both being quiet. They both moved like ghosts as they passed by Jedi Sentinels. Barris and Anakin rounded a corner and saw Master Luminara. She looked into the eyes of both students as she questioned where they were going at such a late time at night. Anakin spoke up, telling Master Unduli that they were heading to the archives to finish some research. Luminara smiled. She was glad to hear that they were doing something productive. She then asked what they were doing research on. Barris spoke up and said that they were looking into the ability of Force Heal. Luminara shook her head and told Barris to stop her obsession with that lost power in the Force. Anakin spoke up to defend Barris, but Barris gestured her hand to Anakin to tell him not to bother. Anakin silenced himself before he spoke, but Luminara demanded that Anakin tell her what he was going to say. Anakin said that Barris was so close to figuring out that she just needed more time. That's why they were going to go study together. Luminara looked at the two of them and decided to let them go, demanding that they be back in their rooms before the middle of the night. Barris bowed to her master and stormed off as Luminara nodded at Anakin and continued sauntering her way through the Jedi Temple. Anakin caught up with Barris to make sure she was okay, and she was alright at the very least. More than ever, though, she wanted to leave the Order. She couldn't at the moment. Right now, she needed to help the people in the Outer Rim. Anakin and Barris ran to the hangar as they picked a ship that could fit the two of them, as they jumped in it and took off. They quickly got the ship out of the hangar bay and into the space of Coruscant. They put in the coordinates for Zygerria. The Zygerians were the largest slave traders in the Outer Rim, and while the Hutts were a massive part of the industry, if the two could shut down operations on Zygerria, then it would possibly put an end to slavery in the Outer Rim by bringing attention to the problems that the Republic was so clearly oblivious to. In hyperspace, Barris and Anakin would have a very deep conversation, as they talked about what it meant to be Padawans to their respective masters. And while Anakin had known about Luminara's blatant behavior, he never really got the chance to see it in person. Barris was more likely to be around Anakin and Obi-Wan than Anakin to Barris and Luminara. Most of it revolved around how much Barris loathed Luminara, but even more she wanted to be free of the chains that Luminara placed around her. Anakin understood more than anyone what it meant to feel put down by someone with more power than you. He told Barris to remember above all that the time would come when Luminara would just be a bad dream. Barris smiled as they both leaned in on one another and placed their heads against one another as they got close. The perfect physical parallel to the support that they gave each other in the emotional realm. They sat like this for several minutes as the comfort took over the time. It was peaceful when Barris and Anakin were with one another. They continued waiting and talking until they came out of hyperspace. It was unlikely that they could get back to the Jedi Temple before the end of the day on Coruscant, so they had to be sure to be quick and precise, so that they could get back before anyone else noticed that they were gone. Luminara was strict, but since Barris was apparently going to the Jedi archives, it wouldn't be a big deal to worry about her for at least a while. Luminara usually let Barris have, at the very much, that much. The two arrived outside of Zygerria, and the planet looked lush and green from the outside, but there was what was on the planet that they had to worry about. Barris could feel the tension building inside of Anakin. He loathed the slavers, and the Zygerians had a reputation for being the cruelest slavers in the galaxy. The two knew that they couldn't land their ship near the capital city. The Zygerians hated the Jedi, and the feeling was almost mutual. Anakin and Barris found a nice patch of forestation to hide the ship in, as they landed and escaped quietly. It was nighttime on this side of the planet, as they traveled in closer and closer to the massive gates of the slaver capital of the galaxy. Anakin and Barris cut a small hole in the wall to make sure that they had an entrance into the city gates. They knew that they could free the slaves, but they needed to have an escape route as well. Barris and Anakin knew that they had to be quiet. Using their lightsabers was not an option here. There were several guards in the area that they needed to worry about keeping an eye out for. The two Jedi walked through and saw slaves of several cultures from across the galaxy. Rhodians, Togrutas, humans, Wookiees. There were so many people that were captured. Barris saw something interesting. She saw a massive grid line that ran across the top half of the city. Barris's eyes followed it as it trailed all the way back into the central building. Anakin was so focused on the shackles he didn't even notice. Barris poked him on the back and pointed at the skyline as Anakin followed his eyes around as the trail led him back to the central building. Anakin smiled as he looked at Barris. The two of them continued in. If they could find the generator and turn off the grid, they could not just only free all the slaves, but they could blow the entire central building into pieces. The two Jedi kept sneaking by guards of all sorts. They knew that they could do some real damage to the Zygerians if they got the guards pulled back into the complex itself. Anakin looked across and saw a thin line that pulled its way into a control room. Anakin gestured to Barris to follow him, and she did. They went into the complex, and they began to realize that they could have their entire plan pulled together in one swoop. Anakin pulled himself into the room as he ignited his lightsaber and cut down two of the guards and silenced himself as they closed the doors behind him. Barris looked at Anakin with disappointment on her face, but she tried to ignore it, because there were more pressing matters at the moment. The two Jedi pulled the alarms in every sector, saying that the central complex was under attack, and made all the guards from all across the city leave their posts. Barris, on the other side of the room, cut the power from the city, releasing every single slave from their shackles. Anakin could hear the Zygerians running towards him. The sounds of footsteps continued to get louder and louder as Anakin and Barris hurried as fast as they could. Anakin was setting the generators inside of the central building to explode, but he needed more time. Barris moved towards the door and sealed it. Anakin pulled the hatch off the central control system as he began rigging the system to explode upon an activation of a button. The Zygerians got to the door as they started banging on the door, trying to get in, and trying to open it as they pushed all the buttons, but the door wouldn't budge. Barris stood adjacent to the door, waiting for Anakin's go signal. He told her to cut a hole in the wall so that they could prepare to evacuate as fast as they could. Barris nodded as she began cutting through the wall. Anakin jumped up from the floor as he held the trigger button in his hands. Anakin ran over to the hole Barris was creating as the two fled the room, just as the Zygerians breached the door. Anakin told Barris to run as he pressed the trigger, and a massive screeching could be heard as the gears began to turn inside of the central console, and a surge of too much power offset the balance of the gears, and then an explosion rang out across the city. The two Jedi heard it, and then they saw the explosion trailing them as they bolted around corners, avoiding guards of all types as the central building began to fall apart from the inside out. Anakin and Barris got outside of the building as they ran as fast as they could, breaking out of the final door and escaping the building behind them as it began to crumble and explode. Barris saw a wave of slaves running from their shackles as she saw them rebelling against their captors, what little captors they still had existing. It was time for them to go. They needed to get off-world before the Jedi were blamed for doing this to the slavers. They saw the slaves uprising as they raided a small armory on the far side of the city. The slaves began taking back their power, and with the Zygerian capital under siege from its own internal explosion, the guards inside of the building had been killed. The slaves had all the opportunity in the world to succeed, and the main building was completely crippled. The two Jedi got back to their ship and ran inside as they looked at each other, smiled. They freed an entire population of slaves and severely damaged the Zygerian slavers. This kind of hurt would set the Empire back generations. Anakin and Barris wrapped their arms around each other. This was so huge. It was a massive victory for someone like Anakin, but even more so a victory for the slaves of the galaxy. It would be hard for the news to not reach the Jedi Order. Anakin thought about his mother momentarily. He knew that he needed to free her as well. Barris knew exactly what he was thinking when she looked into his eyes after their hug. The two of them got to the cockpit and made their break off-world. As they made their way to Tatooine, which was just a short jump away. As their ship entered the air, they could see the chaos from inside the Zygerian capital, as the people fled from their massive slave revolt in the city. The two Jedi made a great escape as fires cascaded across the darkness of the night. The seeds of rebellion were planted, and the fuel that was beginning the uprising in the Outer Rim. Though something as large as this would garner the attention of the Galactic Republic. While slavery was illegal, Zygeria had a massive economy, and if it suddenly stopped being that massive economy in the Outer Rim, it were likely that it was for a good reason. The Galactic Republic would have their noses in the situation almost immediately, but first, Anakin and Barris were going to Tatooine to fix an issue that should have been resolved a long time ago. Upon their arrival in Mos Espa, the two of them would learn that Shmi Skywalker was sold and married on the Lars homestead, a place that Anakin and Barris would have the opportunity to see Shmi in all of her happiness. She was living her life on her own terms. She was living her life on her own terms, and she was no longer a slave, finding love in her own respect. Anakin was happy to see that his mother was okay, and Barris was happy that Anakin was happy. The two Jedi had little time to stay because it was apparent that they needed to get back to the Jedi Temple, to make it apparent that they weren't definitely gone, causing issues on Zygeria. As they traveled through hyperspace, the two of them talked about how they were going to explain themselves if they were caught. While it was their intention to free the slaves so that they could become knights, the collateral damage that ripping apart a player in the galactic economy wasn't exactly positive for their case. Depending on how the Jedi wanted to play the politics in the matter meant everything for them. If the Jedi were discovered to be behind this, they could get in massive trouble from the Galactic Senate. Of course, if they weren't, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. The biggest issue for Barris and Anakin was not really realizing how much an effect this could really have. In their young, eager minds, they thought that this would be brilliant, but they didn't realize that they needed to put it together under a microscope before they went all in to do it. They sat quietly inside of the ship, hoping that the vessel wasn't picked up on cameras or anything of that sort. When the ship arrived at a hyperspace, it landed inside of the Jedi Temple as the morning started to come around. Anakin and Barris went to their separate rooms, and the Jedi Order itself began to awake from its slumber. The Jedi were now all out and about on their own individual journeys inside the temple. Anakin went to his room to sleep, and Barris did the same in hers. The exhaustion of the previous several hours was wearisome, But it was done and over with. Both Jedi would sleep through the day and wake up in the early evening. The Jedi Council was made aware of the issue on Zygerria and would be asked to check on it, but because the Zygerians were slave traders, they refused to act on that. Instead, the Council knew about a ship that had left in the middle of the night, alongside the report that Master Luminara had for her apprentice and young Skywalker, being out and about right about the same time that the ship went missing. The case wasn't looking too good for the two Padawans, though there was one positive. No one had discovered that the Jedi were at all present on Zygerria. The explosion of the main building got rid of any evidence that would have been able to convict any Jedi of the crimes. The only issue was the hole that was cut into the side of the facility. But that hole was made larger when several of the slaves broke it down when they went to steal vehicles from the Zygerians. And while the Council could not openly promote the chaos that was created by Barris and Anakin, the Council could promote the desire for justice. This promotion had to be internal. The Council thought on the matter and what they were to do about it. They first had to wait and see if anyone would discover what happened to the people on Zygerria. So, the Council dispatched Master Plo Koon and Master Windu to the planet to begin an investigation into what happened. The Council was a bit skeptical of what they were doing regarding the situation, but until they knew, they wouldn't do anything, and keep the rest of the Order in the dark about it as well. Mace and Plo would arrive on Zygerria in a short while and they would begin their investigation, while on Coruscant there was not a peep heard about what happened. It was completely locked down, and Barris and Anakin thought they got away with it. That was until about a week later, they were requested into the Council chambers. Both Luminara and Kenobi were already in the chambers, awaiting for their Padawans to arrive. They looked at their teachers, and then they looked at each other, as they placed themselves in the middle of the room and looked over to the Grand Master and the Master of the Order. Both Anakin and Barris were extremely nervous at this point, but then Mace spoke up. Windu told the two that their actions could have been disastrous for the Order, and while that should be punished, and it will be punished, there was something that was more defining about their actions. The actions they committed brought an end to centuries worth of pain and suffering to millions of people on Zygerria. Mace explained that the Council launched an investigation and the Zygerians believed that it was a flaw in their own infrastructure. While the Zygerians weren't fond of the Jedi, they would have no value in lying, especially since the Republic has discovered the nature of what Zygerria's economy was based off of. The Republic would discover that the Zygerians were slavers and their entire economy was primarily operated off of slavery. Mace continued telling the two Padawans that their strike on Zygerrian's capital caused the Republic to dive into the Outer Rim. Because of this, slavery that existed under the noses of the Republic was being put to an end. There was also something that the two Jedi needed to know. That while their actions weren't necessarily condoned, they solved an issue that the Council itself couldn't figure out how to solve, without causing a massive discrepancy between the Republic and themselves. The Council expressed its gratitude to both Anakin and Barris by promoting them to Jedi Knights, though their punishment for going out and creating such ruckus was being basically under house arrest for half of the next upcoming year. And while that didn't sound terrible, they would be tasked with helping either Jocasta Nu or Terra Sanube for the entirety of that time. The two would be split up for the entirety of that time as well, so that they could each individually grow by themselves. The action was taken by the Council because the Council believed that the two needed to be punished for going out and doing so without permission, while they believed that their desire to do right by the Code and for the people of the galaxy was worth a knighting. Becoming a Jedi Knight was a great honor, especially at their ages. At ages 18 and 17, these two were very young to become Jedi Knights, but it also meant that Barris was able to obtain her own freedom from Luminara. When the four were dismissed from the High Council chambers, Obi-Wan expressed his fondness for Anakin's maturity, telling him that instead of being a slave to the past and let it influence him in the present so that he could do better for those around him. Kenobi was extremely proud of Anakin as they both smiled at one another. Obi-Wan placed his hand on Anakin's shoulder and told him that he was a far greater Jedi than he could have ever hoped to be. While Kenobi was initially upset, he was then proud of Anakin because of Anakin's maturity to do right by those who needed it. Luminara, on the other hand, scolded Barris, and while they were no longer master and apprentice, Luminara had Barris almost in tears before she left the elevator in a rush. Obi-Wan stepped up and moved over to tell Barris that she too had elevated herself, being side by side with Anakin as he conquered his demons. That was the truest form of companionship. Obi-Wan praised Barriss for having her own determination to fixing the wrongs in the galaxy. It wasn't her fault that Luminar was upset. The Council rewarded the two of them, and they should both be equally as proud of their accomplishments. Barriss was extremely grateful for Obi-Wan's kindness. Kenobi always wanted the best for Anakin, and he continuously showed it, especially when it came to Anakin's friendship to Barriss. Obi-Wan knew how much it would mean to Anakin if he filled the master role for Barriss as well. Obi-Wan wished the two of them the best of luck when it came to being around Sanube and Jocasta Nu. Obi-Wan bowed as he walked away from the two and continued down the hallway. Anakin and Barriss went back to their spot as they walked over to the garden and began to meditate side by side. Their time together was valuable, and it was especially valuable now, because they would be separated for 6 months for their punishment. It wouldn't mean that they wouldn't be able to see each other, but their time together would be even more restricted than before. Without having two masters dragging them out across the galaxy, they were now stuck on Coruscant, with the librarian and the lead Jedi investigator. Barriss got the honor of being with Terra Sanube, while Anakin was placed with Jocasta Nu. As the next 6 months began, both young Jedi would have a new sense of understanding for themselves. Both Jedi would learn the basics of patience and peace, and of course everything in between, but these two teachers were guides to the Jedi Knights for the beginning of their newest journeys. Barriss got a sense of adventure, and being paired with Terra Sanube was a great choice. She learned valuable skills on top of the immense talent that she already had. Even more so, she was the added benefit of being an investigator with Sanube, so she had the opportunity to leave the Jedi Temple. Anakin, on the other hand, would have the journey of being inside of the Jedi Archives 24/7. He was with Jocasta Nu all the time, and he had no interest in being inside the archives. He had to learn a whole bunch of stuff about the texts anyways, and now he had to learn more. Though most of the time he was just fulfilling the busy work that Jocasta didn't want to do. On the other hand, Barriss and Anakin hadn't separated too much since the beginning of their punishment. As the 6 months dragged over, Anakin and Barriss got closer, not emotionally or physically, but through their connection in the Force. Their connection to one another grew deeper and more focused. Even more so, as 6 months passed, Anakin became 19 and Barriss 18. Both Jedi Knights were ready to turn back into their normal life when all of a sudden the senator from Naboo would be attacked on Coruscant's landing platform. The city would erupt into chaos as Anakin and Barriss would be assigned their first mission with one another. Being that Obi-Wan was currently off-world, they would be the better choice to pair with Padme Amidala. While it was a little worrisome putting Anakin and Barriss together, it would be a nice calming mission for the two to get reacquainted with one another. The Council liked the idea of Barriss and Anakin being around each other because of their endeavors on Zygerria. It was worthwhile to let them have this great experience so that the two of them could get back to speed, though it wouldn't last forever, as they would be soon taken off the world back to Naboo after foiling an assassination attempt on Senator Amidala. The big difference during their trip to Naboo was the lack of an investigator going to Kamino. Instead, Barriss and Anakin were able to spend some alone time while on Naboo, while protecting Padme. This alone time would be perfect for the two. They would finally realize the importance of their bond with one another, especially because it wouldn't be long before a string of dreams that would take Anakin, Barriss, and Padme to Tatooine. Anakin would learn that his mother had been taken by Tusken Raiders, and he and Barriss would disappear into the sands of the desert to find Shmi Skywalker. It wouldn't take long, but at the end of the day they would find a camp, and that would be where the Tuskens were. They would go down into the camp and find Anakin's mother. Anakin would cut a hole in a tent, and Barriss and him would find his mother and take her off of a little prison that the Tuskens had set up for her. Anakin would hold his mother and watch as she tried to say her last words. Barriss ran over and kneeled down next to Anakin and Shmi as she placed her hand on Shmi's stomach as she used the Force to heal Anakin's mother. Her final breath picked up as she began to breathe steadily once again. Anakin looked at Barriss and smiled, with tears in his eyes as he picked up his mother and hugged her as tight as he could without killing her. Anakin, Shmi, and Barriss would all be able to escape the Tusken camp as they made their way back to the Lars homestead, with Shmi safe and alive. On the other hand, the Tuskens wouldn't be slaughtered by Anakin. Anakin and Barriss would have to say their goodbyes as they escorted Padme back to Naboo. By the time they got back to Naboo, they saw a massive fleet. It reminded Anakin and Padme of their previous encounter with droid forces on the planet about 10 years ago. Their shock was met with several droid starfighters flying towards them. They turned their ship around and jumped into hyperspace. The Clone Wars had just begun. With Naboo being the first target of the war was already about to begin on the grand-scale battlefield across the galaxy. With the Republic Army being commissioned, the Clone Wars was fully underway, and with Anakin and Barris being knights, they would be able to spend time on the battlefront, though they would spend a lot of time separated because of the war. Their bond through love would remain strong. The two would be able to talk to one another through communication devices, and the two would always wait for one another inside of the Jedi Temple garden when they weren't deployed. It would be difficult for the two of them, but their bond with one another was always stronger than the divide that war created. Though there was always trouble for Anakin, and that trouble would be the Chancellor that was reeling him in. With the support of Barris, Anakin always felt less inclined to fall for the lies and deceit of the Supreme Chancellor. Anakin was extremely loyal to Barris, and he had no reason to fall for the descent that Palpatine was setting him up for. While Anakin enjoyed the mentorship from Palpatine, there was no real bond for Anakin to latch onto. His relationship with Kenobi was good, other than a few hiccups. His bond with Barris was entrancing, and his mother was still alive, for a matter of fact. For the most part, the Council seemed to be on his side, and there was no real reason to smell foul play in the water, or even consider the idea that there was something working against him. The war was long, but it would see new faces. Anakin would take on an apprentice in the first year of combat, and Barris would take on an apprentice in the second year of combat. Anakin's apprentice was named Ahsoka Tano, and Barris's was Desha Numa. As both lovers found themselves with their own students, they realized an even greater fondness for one another. Seeing one another raise a student and teach them made the other feel extraordinarily respectful towards the other. Their love would be emboldened by watching the other grow as teachers and their respective students grow as Jedi. As the war came closer and closer to an end, the move to turn Anakin to the dark side would become even more apparent by the Chancellor. The attempts were becoming more and more futile as Anakin became more and more tiresome of this plot. Without Ahsoka being barred from the Jedi Order, Barris, Ahsoka, and even Desha became main people in Anakin's life. Obi-Wan was always there too, but he now had a seat on the Jedi High Council. The time would come for the invasion of the city world of Coruscant. The Republic would be sent to defend the capital as droid forces put all their forces into a massive assault against the capital city. Anakin and Ahsoka would be part of a rescue attempt on the Supreme Chancellor. Barris and Desha would be sent to rescue the Chancellor after being stationed on Coruscant. The four would converge with each other inside of the Invisible Hand. With the four Jedi together, their movement through the halls would be unstoppable. Reinforcements would also be on the way, as Obi-Wan Kenobi was making his way to the massive ship to help the Jedi rescue the Chancellor. Inside of the ship, the four Jedi would find their way to the top of the ship and find the Chancellor himself. Barris would whisper to Anakin, telling him that there was something off about the Force in the situation. Anakin's mind being so clear, he didn't really acknowledge what she was trying to say, but he did pick up on something that was wrong here. The four would go down the steps and walk up to the Chancellor and ask if he was alright. The four Jedi would turn around and see Count Dooku enter the throne room. The four Jedi ignited their blades as Ahsoka and Desha stood behind Anakin, and Barris, who both took the lead against Dooku as he ignited his lightsaber as well. Anakin moved in first as he clashed with Dooku. Behind him followed Barris, Desha, and Ahsoka. Dooku was a formidable duelist as he pushed all the duelists away from him. Dooku cut back and forth as Desha fell to the ground as Ahsoka jumped to cover her friend. Ahsoka's Shoto was thrown from her hand as it flew at Palpatine, who was still lodged in his chair. Ahsoka looked at it as it stopped in front of Palpatine's face. Dooku was in the middle of a duel, and none of the other Jedi were looking at the Chancellor. The Shoto fell to the ground as Palpatine's glance looked over at Ahsoka. Barris and Anakin continued pressing their assault, as Desha looked over to see Ahsoka's lightsaber fall to the ground. Desha and Ahsoka walked over to Palpatine with their lightsabers ignited. He knew he was stuck in a bind. He shot lightning at the two Padawans as they were sent flying across the room and tumbling into the wall. Anakin slashed back at Dooku as he turned around and looked at Palpatine rising from his seat. Barris took on Dooku as she and Anakin pushed him back. Anakin blocked a blade as he turned around and kicked Dooku in the chest as he fell to the floor. Anakin ran across the room as he moved to defend the two Padawans who were both on the floor. Barris took advantage of the situation as she held her own blade to Dooku's neck. Anakin jumped as Palpatine ignited Desha's blade to block Anakin's assault. Obi-Wan ran around the corner as he saw Anakin and Palpatine dueling in the middle of the throne room. He jumped down from the balcony and ran over to help his former apprentice. Two blades ignited as they pushed against Sidious. Dooku watched from the other side of the room as he tried to figure out what to do. He could take on Barris, but he was interested in how the situation would unfold. Anakin and Obi-Wan moved like twins as they faced down the Sith Lord himself. Ahsoka jumped into battle. Daisha tried to help, but she had no lightsaber to help with, other than Ahsoka's Shoto. The two Padawans were no match for Sidious as they tried to get out of the way from his incredibly quick strikes. Obi-Wan used his skill from Form 3 to defend against Sidious, as Anakin spun around Sidious and threw his blade into Sidious' stomach. Sidious dropped as Kenobi stabbed Sidious in the chest. The Jedi turned around as Dooku was trying to stand up against Barris. She was thrown from her feet as Anakin ran to save her, using the Force to throw Dooku from his feet into the wall, knocking him unconscious. The Jedi would evacuate the Invisible Hand, with Dooku in custody, as they retreated back to Coruscant. The war would continue. With Grievous as leader of the Droid army and the Separatist movement, the Clone Wars would drag on for about 4 more years. During this time, the Senate would instate a new Chancellor of the Republic, and there would be no knowledge of how Palpatine was killed. As for Dooku, he would be imprisoned for his crimes against the Republic. The Jedi would lead an assault against the Droid forces, and they would put an end to the Clone Wars after an extended period of time. Anakin and Barris would see their apprentices full through their training, and watch them become knights. Barris and Anakin would have their relationship, but keep it hidden. Without ever having their own kids, they shared in the activities that they loved throughout their time inside the Order. Anakin became a master on the Council eventually, and would continue to teach students after his success of his first student. Anakin and Barris would continue to love one another as their time continued until their own respective natural deaths at the end of their lives, in a galaxy full of peace and love. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks to George Story, Benjamin Wells, Jay Hoffman, Warpigman308, Icy Raptor, Gort, and Lauren Sanders, Chancellor, for supporting the channel. Let's hit down the links on this so we can see whatever the next video is. I don't know what it's going to be yet, so like and we'll find out. If you want to see a what if, let me know down below. I read all your comments, but I don't do crossovers. Check out the Twitch, Patreon, and community Discord if you want to be a part of our community together. If you want to learn how to win a Sideshow collectible, go down below. There's a doc listed there. We're shooting for 35,000 subscribers. If we don't hit 35,000 subscribers by July 31st at 11:59 p.m., I will not be doing the giveaway. I will find a new giveaway to do for 50,000, but we were trying to make a push for 35,000 by the end of this month. I believe we can do it. We're only 9,000 off. Actually, we're closer to 8,000, like 300 off. So we can really pull this together, but I need you guys to help me, and I need YouTube not to cuck me again, because I just did that in the last video, and that was kind of obnoxious. Anyways, let's talk about our story that we have here. This was definitely a different story. It's always interesting writing these love stories, but I thought this one was the most fun. Probably because Anakin and Barris are the closest in age, so they have the most time to grow together. Obviously, in the Anakin Never Being Discovered video, I had a lot of leeway to do that. You know, I had a lot of leeway to create my own character, and that's what I did with my beloved Zena Pax. And I suggest you watch that video because it's really good. But I got to do something different here with a character that's already been established, right? You guys know about Barris. We all know about Barris because of what she did to Ahsoka. And I get to take a character that we all know and kind of bring her to life in a different aspect, you know, give her something new. And we get to encounter Barris before we really know about her. We don't know a lot about Barris before she becomes Luminara's student. So I got to fill in that gap. And I tried to fill in that gap with a little bit of, she's a little bit rambunctious, but she's not outspoken. You know, she's a kid, but she doesn't talk a lot, so she acts like a kid and doesn't talk a lot. So we see that she's already kind of this quiet person, but she interacts with Anakin, and she really gets to understand that there's more to life than the code. And that's something that I think is going to leave a really important impact on her, because again, she's a kid. She's going to be impressionable by someone that's older than her. Anakin, being the oldest in the class, the way I set it up here, is going to be someone to look up to. You know how little kids are, they always like to be around the oldest person. You know, if you're a kindergartner and you know a first grader, that's like the thing. Like, you are the coolest kid. So I'm kind of going with that idea there, right? You know, and again, it's a story about kids in the beginning, right? We're telling a story about kids. These are not adults, these are kids. They're like 8, 9 years old. They're not old. So again, you have to kind of relax here. And understand what's going on. And then what we take from there is their bond that grows together. They both grow together. They both grow up together. And through that time, Anakin expresses what it's like to have emotions. And I have to say, my literary inspiration for this is literally The Giver. It's one of my favorite books ever, and it's my inspiration for this. And some of the hyperboles that I use in this, some of the metaphors that I use in this, and the colorless spectrum, you know, seeing everything in black and white. It's very visual for how I want to depict emotions, and that was all intended. Emotion is something that we can't see. It's something we all feel. As all being human beings, I believe that you're all human beings watching this, unless your dog is watching this while you're sleeping. We all have these emotions, right? We all feel these emotions, and we all act upon our emotions. And I wanted to describe it in a way that The Giver does so beautifully, and it's describing everything as in literally being black and white. And while everything isn't black and white, the code itself is black and white. And Anakin doesn't live in a black and white world. He lives in a colorful spectrum. He has all the colors, he has pastels, and everything, you know. He's Picasso over here, and all these other guys are like, yeah, well, we're taking pictures in the 1940s, we haven't discovered color yet. And it's like, yeah, that's cool. So we have to take that and kind of develop that further and kind of do something unique with it. And I thought that was one of the more fun things to do about this story, is kind of tell that aspect of emotionality. And I think emotionality is a big player in this story, and I think without the emotionality, I think the story doesn't really be that compelling. I don't think the story is at all compelling without the emotionality, because I think the emotionality really drives the story forward. As for going forward, there's a lot of time jumps, and the story kind of got really hard for me to write at the end, because it just was like, all right, they're in love, and, you know, they kind of got there. And I'm going to tell you, it's really hard writing Palpatine's death all the time. The sequels needed to have a new bad guy that wasn't Palpatine, because it's any era I do, he's the bad guy. It's so hard. I'm being honest when I say that, because I always want it to be an interesting death. I don't want it to be the same death you've seen before, especially for people that have watched the channel over and over again. It gets boring after a while. I don't want to see Palpatine die the same way. So instead of him just dying, I decided for it to be kind of goofy. And it's kind of goofy, I'm going to admit it. I'm not going to act like it's perfect. You know, I've had better endings for Palpatine, but imagine if someone's lightsaber was thrown from their hand and it was flying at him. What's he going to do? Is he going to defend himself, or is he just going to stand there and watch it go through his cranium? I don't think he's going to let that happen. He's going to use the Force to stop it. And he would hope that no one would see it, and then he would notice that Ahsoka was just like, what? So, again, that was kind of supposed to be like a little bit of a comedic relief, but again, I'm just trying to find a new way to make it interesting, make it something that's not just the same ending over and over again, you know? And I always try and shoot for that, so I hope I accomplish that. But anyways, guys, I hope you all enjoyed this. My voice is giving out on me. I love you all. Spread the love. Also, shoot for 35,000 subscribers. Subscribe, share. Come on, let's get this stuff going and out. I believe we can do. I believe we can hit 35. I want to give away a Sideshow collectible, because I think that'd be such a fun giveaway to do. Anyways, I love you all. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.